Okay, everybody, thank you for joining. So this week I decided to have our prompt be an article. This article is The Case for Reparations that was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a very long article. It took me close to 2 hours to read. But I came across this article a couple years ago when it was actually a part of this larger book, this anthology of articles written by this guy called We Were 8 Years in Power. I was particularly moved by this article because, well, I don't know. I feel like in general, I can be kind of like wishy-washy when it comes to like political topics, especially like, things where there's sort of like two sides to the debate. I feel like sometimes I have a hard time choosing. But this is a topic that it's like after reading this article, it really resonated with me. And it's, a political issue that I feel strongly about. And I don't think there are too many of those. So I think I thought this would make a good, interesting podcast topic. And so I asked everybody here to take a read at it. And I think most of us were able to. It was quite long. So, I completely understand if y'all didn't. But yeah, so let's see. I guess I'll get started with sort of my thoughts on the article. So yeah, it's about reparations for the African-American community in the United States. And reparations, I guess, what do we mean by that? I think like sort of the honest, straight up answer, I think, is that it would be sort of some monetary amount that would be given to the African-American community today. That, it's hard to determine like how much money, but that's sort of the point of the article, I feel like, is that it's not so much like how much money we give, or not necessarily like the practical concerns, which, obviously the practical concerns are important, but there's more this question of this moral reckoning in the United States of like, how can we sort of see ourselves squarely, as is said in one really nice part of the piece. How can we see ourselves squarely without really dealing with this issue of slavery and Jim Crow laws and, separate but equal. And so reparations are a way to sort of make up for that, which, would come through money or some other means, but basically this idea that there is this moral imperative or these moral debts that we have to pay off to really see ourselves whole as a country. And so, yeah, I guess that like the moral aspect for me is really kind of what resonates with me. And so like, it's kind of what I was like touching on just now, like how would we enact these reparations? Like on the one hand, like, I look up the definition for reparations, and, money is explicitly in like in the definition, but I sort of struggle to like I don't know. To me, it's not necessarily about the money, right? Like how much money we have to give them, but sort of this like, moral imperative that we need to do something to help this community. And so, yeah, I don't know. Those are sort of my big picture thoughts on it. Any immediate responses to that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because I think practically, yeah, I don't know that straight money is the answer. I think we can definitely talk about that. But I certainly think that the nature of what's happened and how long it's happened, and the degree to which the injustice is, I think, yeah, there certainly should be some kind of compensation given, right? And I think, some policies in theory try to go that route, like affirmative action or like diversity hire programs at companies. And again, I don't know that they always get there, but yeah, I think big picture for me, it's like when we ask the question, how far, like how much of a debt do we have to pay? How long do we have to pay it? Yeah, I think the answer is it's like any other debt, right? You pay it until you've fulfilled your debt, right? You pay it until you're squared away and everyone's gotten what is owed to them, right? And like on one hand, personal debt dies with the owner, right? Like that's why I don't think it's fair to say, oh, you inherit the debts of your grandfathers, right? In a sense, like white people like bearing the cost, but the country itself, like our government, our entire, like all of our institutions were basically built on slave labor. And those institutions are still alive and well. And given that they're alive and well, yeah, I think they should pay the debt I think the answer is you pay the debt up until we stop seeing any kind of significant economic difference between Black and white families.
It's like, how do we know when we've reached there? Like, when do we stop? Like, these questions of practicality, I feel like, I think it's an issue with the article a little bit, like, as far as like things that are implementable today or things that we can do today. I feel like the only thing that's mentioned is this HR 40 bill, right? This bill in Congress to study reparations and in the effects that it's had on people, which apparently there's like a similar bill that's passed in California, which is, certainly good and encouraging. I mean, I absolutely support the bill as like, yeah, we should study it. But I think the fact that like, he doesn't really dive into the specifics of like, how can we implement like reparations, I think sort of opens up, the first question I have about, like, how do we implement this? Like, what is it that we have to do? Is it just give them money? Like, obviously then it's like, how much money? And then like, it's just, how can we like practically implement reparations, I think is sort of the biggest question I have about the topic.
It's so since, I mean, I hadn't read the article, but I was about to ask you guys, did the person, it sounds like you kind of already answered my question, but did he list any kind of examples in the article of like specific compensation? Like, did he say money or like, do you list other examples?
Yeah, I think they spent the majority of the article just making the case that, like, and that's the thing, right? You have to make an article that long to even bring the topic to the table to say, oh, this is something we should look into. And
Right.
It's justified that there could be a case for it, right? Because a lot of people won't even hear it. They're like, I don't know, because a lot of people don't even acknowledge that there's like a systemic issue, right?
Right.
So I think him not dealing with the specifics, the author was male, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think him not dealing with like the implementation of it was more of like a length issue. Like, I think he would have needed another article at least as long as the one he'd written. It just wasn't like on the same focus.
Yeah, I think like he makes comparisons to the reparations that were done for the Holocaust. Like Germany paid Israel some amount of money. West Germany ultimately agreed to pay Israel 3.45 billion Deutsche Marks, or more than $7 billion in today's dollars. And then it talks about like how that was able to spur the Israeli economy and something about like Israeli merchant ships. I don't know.
Wait, sorry, question on that.
Okay.
They gave the Israeli government, not the like. Well, I mean, yeah. Actually, I don't know how many families of survivors.
I believe it was West Germany gave money to Israel. I think country to country is how it happened.
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of see how that's kind of a reparation. Well, how many survivors or family of survivors were there? Were there like a lot? Do people know how many just descendants there were of like survivors? I mean, is that something they
you do ask an interesting question about it, like, like it's to Israel, but like these were like European Jews, so like,
yeah, so like I don't know how that would really benefit them. That's like if the U.S. government was like, "Yo, let's toss money at Africa," to help African Americans.
Israel was formed as a result of World War II, right? Like modern Israel, yeah, isn't it largely composed of European Jews that fled Europe?
I mean, the entire point was, to create a homeland for the Jewish people.
Yeah. So it's essentially like if all the descendants of slaves in America went off and created their own country, and we're like, oh shit, instead of giving it to them directly, let's give it to that country, and that will directly benefit all the descendants of slaves.
I mean, there was an attempt to create such a country. That's Liberia.
Yeah. So yeah, it would be. Right.
But what's more kind of thorny about this situation is it's not a neat problem where one government can say, okay, fine, we'll pay you a lot of money and just give it straight to you. You're dealing with people living inside your own borders who perhaps don't have a monolithic representation. Yeah. So in a sense, even if you wanted to pay reparations, the US government or whoever pays has to deal with millions and millions and millions of people. And it's also it's a lot, well, how do I say it? It goes back farther in time.
Yeah. And so, sort of related to that, like, you know, Germany gives money to Israel to sort of, I guess, atone for what happened to Jews at large, right? And like, I guess as far as this like question of African American reparations, I feel like sort of my first thought would be like, these should be descendants of slaves or people who have maybe lived in America for generations. Like
So your boy wouldn't qualify.
yeah, I would think that people like Melis and Uche wouldn't qualify. I mean, they're like first generation immigrants. It's like it doesn't seem as appropriate, right? It doesn't seem like I feel like these are reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and like that 400 years of history, right? Like of like African Americans living in the United States. I mean, how do we implement that? How do we say like, okay, so these people who were descendants of these people, I guess, would get reparations? But yeah, I don't know. I mean, is that like messy to just say like?
No, dude, I think it's.
I don't know how many records there are of that, to be honest. I don't know.
Right, because it's like, are we saying only descendants of slaves have been victims of like racial injustice? Because like,
absolutely
I think it's a broader issue. Yeah, absolutely not. Right, like it's like the whole. I think part of the justification for reparations is like, this isn't black poverty is not like white poverty. Black justice and not like white justice, right? And it's in every layer of our society, right? We don't nitpick like, oh, you know, it only affected you judicially or only affected you in the house. Like every black person is treated different from like every white person in America, just based on how they look, right? Like purely because they have African descent, right? And so I think it should be as simple as you take a DNA test, you have sub-Saharan African DNA, or hell, maybe just African period in your genome, you qualify for reparations, and maybe we do the cutoff at like, I don't know, 1/8 or something.
Maybe.
You know,
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. Not that I disagree with the article or anything, but I do think there's like a big fundamental problem that I wish the article had gone into a bit more. It's probably a length thing, in that the systems of discrimination and segregation still exist, right? They haven't been fully eliminated. We have fair housing laws. Yes, a lot of progress was made in the 60s, and we had a lot of civil rights legislation. But you come to St. Louis, and Black people are still concentrated into certain neighborhoods, and there's a system of policies and a system of government that kind of keeps it that way largely. There hasn't been a dilution in the past 50 years. It's still incredibly concentrated. So I feel like, we could talk about giving people money, but what's the point of giving people money if the utility they get out of that money is limited by discriminatory systems that still exist? I think, we need to focus on getting rid and really rooting out the rest of the discriminatory framework, the systemic racism, I guess you could call it, that still exists in our government, before we can, say, okay, this money that we're giving to Black people has real utility and it'll solve the problem, right? Because if the system is still broken, then the money is not going to be that effective.
So, I mean, but that's the thing, right? Do we need to wait for a perfect system before we pay any money? Or can they go in tandem, right?
So that kind of goes into my second point, I guess, which I was going to make a little later, which is that I think, a reparations system, and again, I think, we're in a bit of a bind here in that the article doesn't really give us a definition of reparations that, is useful in terms of policy, right? Like it doesn't say, oh, we need to give X number of people X amount of money. It's just like this kind of vague concept, right? But I think, our existing welfare system is probably already an effective form of reparations. And I feel like we should just bolster that and improve that system instead of, creating this entire new layer of government that's just giving out wads of cash to descendants of slaves. I don't think that's, a particularly effective way of doing things, but we can get into that discussion later. But I think, the deficiencies of our current system are really significant. I think, it's not just that it's not perfect, but that it's actively still discriminatory. And he talks about that a bit at the end of the article, where he mentions what happened during the Great Recession with, the predatory loans that were targeted towards Black people. But it goes far deeper than that. And I mean, I can give a few examples. I don't want to ramble too much. But I don't think a lot of even white liberals really recognize the magnitude of what needs to change before these systems are truly transformed and no longer discriminatory.
David, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. I think I totally agree with Justin. I think the real problem in society is, it's one thing to say, okay, we want to pay reparations for the fact that, slavery built the institutions of this country. But the problem is the institutions of this country are still broken, right? There's still so much implicit racism, whether it's, where you can buy a house, redlining, right? How easy it is to take out a loan. I was reading the other day, if house appraisers came to your house and they saw a picture, it's a biracial couple versus an all white couple, same house. They did this experiment. The house would be appraised lower for, if they had a portrait of or a picture of a biracial couple on display. It's so pervasive, and it just makes me wonder, okay, it makes me wonder if cash payments would really do away with this system, or if it's a way to just wash our hands and say, oh, okay, we've fulfilled our moral obligation by doing this. We can move on now without actually addressing the underlying problems, which are much harder to solve than even just giving straight cash to people.
Yeah, I do want to move the discussion away from reparations being straight cash. Like that's, I think, it sort of turns me off, and I feel like most people here, it turns them off too, where like,
Agreed.
it's, I don't know, I feel like it's a distinctly American problem where it's like, oh, if we just throw money at it, it'll fix the problem, right? And so like, yeah, I certainly feel like we ought to move the discussion away from that. Like, yeah, that's certainly not how I envision, the ideal reparations policy to be. But I guess, so to the point about like, there's still certainly systemic racism, and it's still certainly a big problem in our country. But I guess sort of how I read the article was more that like maybe up until, the Civil Rights Act, like maybe the last generation or two, like racism was truly institutionalized, institutionalized in the form of slavery, institutionalized in the form of Jim Crow laws, right? And in the form of these selling, like, what was it, buying houses on contract, right? Like these like predatory loans that were given out to these people where like they weren't even building equity on their houses, but they were basically like, yeah, it was like they're like renting it and owning it, but like they had the worst of both worlds apparently. But yeah, so basically this idea of like institutionalized racism, like something that was like in our edicts and in our laws is, I think, a clear thing to give reparations for, and where like, like sort of that sort of gives us the moral imperative, like, okay, we explicitly wronged these people. And so like that, sort of gives us a justification to think about like, what do we need to do about it? And so that's the part that really like, resonated with me, right? That the truly institutionalized racism that happened in our history, and he kind of goes through that in the article, and how that means we should do something about it today. Like sort of the comparison is the Holocaust, right? Where like, prejudice against Jews, like, anti-Semitism still happens today, right? But like the thing that, warrants reparations and true atonement is the Holocaust, right? Like sort of like pinpointing like slavery as being as bad as that, or just the treatment of Blacks in America as, being as bad as the Holocaust, right? Like, I think it's, certainly, absolutely, like racism is bad today. And, honestly, the issue is a little bit more insidious now because like, oh, we have like equal rights and equal voting, but it's, there's sort of like insidious ways to sort of undermine that. And so that's, absolutely bad, and something needs to be done about it. But I guess to me, it was more about like the explicit obvious evils that were done in the past and making up for that now. Was sort of my take on like the moral imperative of the argument.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I think like the study is going to be important to really figure out how to like really achieve the goals that reparations are going for. And if the conclusion is that cash payments are not going to cut it, or maybe it's only a part of the solution, yeah, I think we should follow wherever the evidence is, right? But I think, yeah, to the point about it being more than money, I think reparations should be about policies that disproportionately and specifically benefit Black Americans, ideally those who are descendants of slaves, right? Even if we're not even thinking about like just cash payments, right? So like welfare would not be reparations because it helps all poor people, right? It doesn't specifically look at like Black Americans and say we're going to help you, right? Similarly, I mean, I guess you could make the argument that since more Black people are below the poverty line, that helps more Black people. But
That's what
I
I
think
was
it
going
should
to
be.
say.
Yeah, but I still think that at the end of the day, I feel like that doesn't cut it because the kind of discrimination and the dangers and the legacy of slavery in our country, lives in a different way for Black Americans from white Americans. Even if like the guy who wrote the counter article, even if it varies on an individual level, like how can we make these amends for like are we going to tell these people who have suffered through much of the same injustices because of slavery, we're going to say, oh, because your family's a little better off now, we're not going to help you out and make amends for the injustice that you and your ancestors suffered? Like, I don't think so. I think it needs to be specifically Black people, not income based, whatever the solution.
I have two questions kind of related to that. So if you're saying that, certain programs that we have in place should prioritize Black Americans that have suffered, does something like affirmative action already do that, right? I feel like on some it does. I don't know if there's a systemic policy in place to say, okay, if you can document that you come from this background, then you are even more deserving of acceptance to whatever program, whatever it may be. And the other thought I had was, so much of this country is built around two things. It's built around sustained accumulation of wealth, in the form of a house or something like that, and then also your education. So I was wondering if you could have both a concerted program to give better education to these folks and to pay for it, obviously, and then also something to counteract decades of discriminatory lending, like an affirmative action for home loans or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think with affirmative act. Yeah, go ahead, Mills.
I don't know. I was just kind of jumping on David's point. I was thinking about something that would help with housing because I feel like that's a huge issue, right? I mean, so many white families have built wealth over time, especially with like home ownership that, a lot of African Americans haven't been able to, cash in on. So like something that would kind of help, I guess, level the playing field, at least with housing.
No, I mean,
I can give you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. Well, I can give you my radical take on it, which is that we won't have equality in housing, homeownership, and all the opportunities for wealth that generates until we like radically dismantle the way our like local governments are set up. So my belief, and this is something that I think is very obvious, and the article like is pretty much entirely based on home ownership and land ownership, right? As these huge opportunities, not just in the 50s and the 20th century, but also in the 19th century. This huge opportunity, I'll get into Georgism, I guess, a little later. But all of these opportunities for land ownership and the accumulated wealth that comes with that Black Americans were locked out of, right? They had no opportunity to participate in that economy and that opportunity. And I feel like it's still that way today. And I feel like something that the article really missed, I think that was like essentials of this discussion is zoning, which is a system that still exists today, where in the early 20th century, all American cities instituted zoning laws that restricted at the time the majority white neighborhoods to be single family only, which restricted the supply of housing, makes housing more expensive, and locks minorities out of those neighborhoods. And it still exists today. Every city has a zoning code, and most of those zones have not changed in decades. And white neighborhoods are still disproportionately exclusive single-family areas where Black Americans are simply locked out of living there. And then white Americans have moved out of the inner cities into their own suburbs and created their own towns where they have the power to create their own zoning laws, and then they block any sort of public housing or affordable housing that could ever allow a Black person to move to a higher opportunity neighborhood and kind of establish themselves and start building up that wealth, right? That's what I'm saying, like with how these systems are still deeply ingrained in our society. And I feel like, you know, white America has made progress. You know, people acknowledge that Black Lives Matter now, and there's a growing acceptance of, you know, racial justice. But like some of these issues are not really, have not been meaningfully addressed, right? There's still just like discriminatory zoning. We still have like municipalities that block affordable housing and restrict who can move into the city. It's a huge problem that just needs to be completely reckoned with before I think any true progress can be made on that front.
So is like, are you saying discrimination is like codified still?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And you know, like zoning codes don't explicitly say, oh, Black people can't live in this town or neighborhood, but the effect has been, and the intent was when they were written, that, you know, we keep these neighborhoods exclusive, only accessible to those with higher incomes who are disproportionately white. And it's still being enforced today. It's uncanny how powerful that system is and how little attention it gets.
It was one of Trump's big talking points in a lot of his his campaigning and in the first debate, right? He was saying like they want to bring affordable housing into your suburbs, and it was a big issue for a lot of white voters like decades ago.
Yeah,
but now people don't care.
But you know, even in California, like even in, you know, the most liberal states, Connecticut, for example, has like many parts of Connecticut, the richest parts are currently zoned where like the smallest a residential piece of land can be is like 1/4 of an acre. So obviously you have to have like boatloads of money to even like buy a house in many parts of Connecticut. And of course, the people who have the money are white people who typically inherited that money because their parents had big houses. You know, it's like this big system that just keeps Black people concentrated in these neighborhoods where they were initially intended to live. And white people get to kind of wall off their neighborhoods and say, okay, we've restricted the supply of housing. No one new can move in here. The intent is to keep minorities out, right? And no one will ever say it explicitly these days, but when you hear talk about neighborhood character or overpopulation and stuff like that, there's usually some coded language.
Buildings.
Yeah, and then people get, you know, explicitly racist when it comes to like opening up their public schools to like people from other neighborhoods, right? Like undesirable people coming into their neighborhood and, you know, taking over their kids' school. I think it's a very explicit system of discrimination that still exists and is being enforced every day across the country.
Right, you hear it everywhere. I hear it, you know, I heard it in my hometown when they tried to build public transit into it, and they voted because, you know, they're like, oh, think of the people it'll bring into this town.
Yeah, so actually, I want to make a book recommendation. If you read this article and you found it interesting, which I think everyone did, you should absolutely read The Color of Law.
I have it.
Yes, it's a book by I can't remember Ross.
Can you put it in the Facebook chat?
Yeah, I can link it. I read it last year. Boys. Yeah, it's an incredible book that goes into detail about how American cities systematically excluded Blacks from home ownership and then concentrated them to certain neighborhoods. And zoning is a fundamental part of that system. And honestly, when I was reading this article, most of it is covered in the Color of Law, so I already knew about it. But I was kind of disappointed it didn't mention zoning and its enduring legacy as like a component of that.
Do we think, Justin, this is a question for Justin, but also to everyone else here, you know, with the fact that cities are kind of diversifying and they're developing in a way that would not have been possible a couple of decades ago, right? You have development and dense housing and whatever in cities, and people are coming back from the suburbs into the urban core. Is that an opportunity to change the dynamic in terms of access to housing, but also access to the ability to concentrate wealth over generations?
Well, I think it is. And I think, you know, there is diversification happening now that, you know, the most discriminatory housing laws, the explicitly discriminatory laws, the redlining, et cetera, has been, you know, dismantled. You know, Black home ownership is growing and Black people are moving into white neighborhoods at some rate and, you know, getting that opportunity. But I think a huge problem that still exists is what I call municipal fragmentation. And I wrote a blog post about this last month. But it's basically where, like, think of like, how in Houston, for example, there are other municipalities around Houston, like Sugar Land and Bel Air and the Woodlands, right?
Westview.
And they are independent from Houston, right? They're like their own towns with their own laws and policies, right? These places are disproportionately wealthy and white, but that's a different point. All of the towns in Houston are part of the same ecosystem, right? They all kind of use the same infrastructure. People from Sugar Land commute into Houston for jobs and then go back out to their home in Sugar Land. They're all like part of the same economy, but they are organized in a way that they're walled off from each other, right? So the resident of like the Woodlands can go into Houston and use all of Houston's infrastructure and get all the advantages of being next to Houston, and their house is valuable because it's near Houston, right? But then they get to go back to the Woodlands and not pay any taxes into Houston, right? They just get to kind of exploit Houston for being there and not be responsible for all of its liabilities, right? The infrastructure and the low-income people who need extra services and the schools. And I think it's an explicitly racist system. I think you look at what happened in the 1950s. Back in the early 20th century, Americans generally lived under the same municipal leadership, right? Like in St. Louis, there was only the city of St. Louis, and everyone, black and white, they all lived in the same city, and they all paid taxes to the same governing body. But then in the 50s, when white people realized that the Supreme Court, as mentioned in the article, wasn't going to let them, keep black people out of neighborhoods exclusively and have these like rigid racial exclusion covenants and everything, they just left the city altogether. They went and founded their own cities, right? And they said, fuck this. We're just abandon the old city and create our new ones where we can have complete control over zoning and taxes and everything. And the result is we have this fucked up system where in every city around the country, you have suburbs that are incredibly wealthy and very white that surrounds the central city, which is black and poor. And those suburbs, get all the benefits of being able to wall themselves off, limit the supply of housing, and keep other people out while exploiting the city, the central city, and all of its poor people and all of the jobs that are concentrated there. And I think that system needs to be completely dismantled before you can have any hope of actually integrating America's neighborhoods and having equality between blacks and whites. And I don't think it's a system that liberals are aware of at all.
These suburbs are like leeches. What the? I never knew that.
No,
I mean,
true.
you see it everywhere.
My family lives in one of those suburbs.
And I'm not saying that people who move to suburbs are like actively discriminating, but we're all participating in a system that's been set up to like concentrate wealth and poverty in certain areas, and the result obviously is that black people are the poor ones who live in the poor places, and white people are the rich ones. And it was an explicitly racial thing when it happened. When whites moved out of Detroit and St. Louis and Houston, et cetera, and founded places like Plano and Sugar Land, they were doing so they could maintain the homogeneity of their neighborhoods. Right? It was explicit. And if you read The Color of Law, you can see how that happened. It lays it out in perfect detail.
That's why the MARTA system in Atlanta isn't expanding towards the east. It's expanded all the way north, where all the white people live.
Yeah.
Over here on the east side, it's short as crap.
The other problem with a lot of urban infrastructure is, you have, look at Atlanta. What funds the core infrastructure? It's whatever's in Fulton County, and everything around it doesn't have to pay its fair share. You see this in a lot of cities, and I was going to mention to Justin, okay, what if we had something like a regional government for a metropolitan area? But then I think, okay, I come from Portland, Oregon. There's Metro. It's the only regional government in the US. But does it do any better? No, not really, because it's gridlocked. And you have commissioners that are responsible for the suburbs, and they're constantly fighting with the people who represent, the urban core. So you have that difference in opinion, and I don't care if it's through a regional government or if it's through Harris County, which is so big that it, effectively functions as one. You have balkanization of cities and of viewpoints to where even if you wanted to fund region-wide development and wealth redistribution, you're still going to have people getting in the way of that. And it doesn't matter what structure it is.
I don't know. I think the structure matters in that, like some wealth sharing is better than none, right? Like opening up school districts so that everyone can access high quality education is better than the current situation, which is where it's all walled off and some school districts are privileged by having a bunch of rich people in their boundaries and others aren't. I like what other countries do with regional governments. What were you saying?
I just wanted to offer a little bit of pushback on, I feel like there's this idea that like fixing housing is sort of like the end all be all to solving this problem. When I don't know, I mean, this is actually an argument that was mentioned by my roommate. Like, I mean, it's sort of like I feel like it's pretty simplistic, but basically like, people tend to live with people of their like who are similar to them, right? So like people like want to live in communities with like people that share like the same similar culture, similar heritage, and so that those sort of divisions, one might say, are like natural, right? Like this, divisions of like these singularly homogenous places, right? Like it's, I mean, in general, I feel like there's freedom of movement in the United States. There, discrimination is not, I don't think, explicitly codified. It certainly like has a history of it, and right, and I think it is that history that we need to like sort of repair and atone for. But it is, I don't know. I'm not sure if like having everyone live together, kumbaya, is like sort of really like what we should. It's like that's the answer, right? I don't know if that's the answer, because there was actually this podcast that I listened to recently from the New York Times called "Nice White Parents." It's basically about like these people who live in New York. It's like in the Brooklyn area. Like all the really nice white private schools are like getting overpopulated. Like all these rich people are moving in, and like they can't fit all the students. And so some of the nice white parents are sending their students off to like poorer schools. And so then like it's studying sort of like the dynamic that's happening at these poor schools. Like suddenly these poor schools are getting a lot more money. They're getting like funding for weird things like French club, like sponsoring people to go to France and stuff, when they're, these usually like the sort of the student population wasn't necessarily interested in that, but now there's students who are interested in that, or parents of the students who are interested in like getting that happening. And so, I mean, the whole thing was like kind of like an interesting display of like how it's awkward to like, I mean, these communities have sort of like naturally been built, and certainly it's appalling to see that like one gets like resources and the other doesn't. But then like suddenly when you try to move resources into this poor neighborhood, like the response from the community is a little bit like, wow, this is like sort of not what we wanted. Or I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess, because with regards to the article, you were saying like he didn't like go deep into this whole zoning laws and like everything that happened with regards to the color of housing laws, right? But I feel like that's intentional because it's not necessarily just housing, right? It's I think again it's something. Like the word that I'm using is like it's a moral argument, right? There's like a moral reckoning, right? That we need to come to terms with, and we can start thinking about solutions that would either be wads of cash or something in housing, or maybe it's education. I mean, that's something that maybe I would argue for more.
I think my point is that my view is that the moral reckoning has to be that white Americans have to be willing to live in the same society as Black Americans, and I don't think we currently do. I think I use St. Louis a lot because since I moved here, it's been kind of a striking lesson for me, I guess, coming from a more integrated city to one of the most segregated cities in the country. You come here and you cross these invisible barriers, and the outcomes are just so radically different because white people have essentially removed themselves from any geographic spaces that they could share with Black people, or political spaces, right? I think much of the latter half of the 20th century was just this continuous movement of white people into their own defined jurisdictions where they could, pool their resources and control their environment. And even today, in even the most liberal parts of the country, white people are not willing to inhabit the same society as black people. I'm not saying, white and black people need to like be neighbors literally.
Yeah.
But I do think they need to share the same government and share the same resources, right? And be part of the same system.
Yeah.
I don't think that's happening now.
Yeah, I think the more important point is like the resources aren't going to these communities, right? So I don't think I wouldn't really care about going and living with a bunch of other white neighbors. I mean, it's really just about the resources going to these communities, because I can definitely tell a difference between communities in like the east side of Atlanta where there's a bunch of, where it's mostly African American, and then where you go to like northern or western parts where it's mostly like more rich or like white communities. Like there's a stark difference. Like it is much nicer in the northern and like western parts, and like on the east side, like the roads are like crap. The communities look pretty bad. There's a stark difference. So it's more about the resources than like people living together. I don't really think, like, I think what what you were saying your roommate was mentioning, people like living with people who are more similar to them. Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely true. But the problem is that these two groups of people aren't getting the same like basic resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, so that's like, when I think of reparations, that's what it means to me, right? It's not giving people money. It's not like figuring out, okay, who's descended from a slave and here's X amount of dollars, right? It's having whites and blacks literally live under the same system and ending this like systemic supremacy for whites that allows them to kind of live in these gated communities where they never have to interact with their fellow Black Americans.
Yeah. So over the course of you explaining that, I immediately was sold on the idea that ending these issues of where you live and where the resources flow with like to these different neighborhoods that are ethnically divided, I absolutely think is kind of like at the root of the issue, right? And like, yeah, at first I was like, maybe it's education, maybe it's other things, but it's really hard to contend with the fact that like if your neighborhood, if your city can't provide good schooling, if it can't keep you safe, it can't keep your family safe, if it can't keep drug dealers off the sidewalk, it can't provide basic services, then there's like those outcomes are going to be worse the rest of your life, regardless of how much we try to patch it up later with affirmative action or just straight cash payment. So like, yeah, I absolutely think the environment is core, right? And then, along that train of thought, I feel like the core of the issue for me isn't necessarily they need to live under the same government, even in more in that they need to have a parity of resource level, right? I don't think that like there would be an issue that all these white people live in Sugar Land and live in these nice big houses if these black people who live in the Loop also had nice big houses within black neighborhoods, but that's not the case, right? And then thinking about how like Osmond's story where like these white neighbors moved into these poor neighborhoods and they provide these resources and these new activities that weren't there before. And apparently the maybe I'm mischaracterizing all these, so stop me if I am, but it seemed like the reaction wasn't altogether positive. They were like, oh, what's this about? And I think that's largely like from what I've heard and seen, that Black Americans and minorities in general don't want to succeed or become wealthy or become equal only on the white man's terms, right? Like, oh, you get to have like a good job and a good income, but as long as you become white or you speak like a white person or you live in these white neighborhoods, right? So I don't know that moving Black people or giving them access to white neighborhoods is like a solution that even Black people want. I think
So
it's having these
is that a problem with reparations and like in the whole, I guess, like, because like in the article, I just feel like it really was about the struggle between white and Black. And so like the article read as white people need to do something about this. And like I think that's one like sort of awkward thing about like reparations is like especially in the case of like money, or say like, do they want to just be given money like that? Do they want to this? Like how, I don't know. I mean,
so here's something I like, because I don't know that money would be the fix, right? But clearly there is a lack of overall capital in areas that are majority Black, right? It's not like poor people are everywhere and it's like Black people, where Black people live, tends to have less infrastructure, less investment in education, worse health outcomes, worse even just grocery store availability, right? And I guess a positive in terms of like reparations of cash payments is like, number one, when you give someone cash, you give them autonomy, you give them the freedom to do with it as they please. And so you're not telling Black people, oh, you need to come to these predominantly white colleges, these white elite institutions where you probably can't relate to lots of these like trust fund babies and wealthy people anyway, right? And maybe you were growing up in a system that, like, yeah, I read this in Malcolm Gladwell's book. A lot of times in affirmative action, they place people who academically can't succeed in these 1% schools, but they would have excelled in these like 10 to 20% schools, right? So at the end of the day, if your goal is to get them better schooling, better job, it might not even be the best way, right? And again, I feel like all these outcomes are like success or equality on the white man's, or what the institution says you ought to get. But cash is like, you in a sense get to make your own destiny. And I think to another point is like, if this cash flows directly into Black communities and the taxes flow directly, I don't know how the taxation system works, but if that cash flows directly into the infrastructure that's living around them, right, inevitably these neighborhoods will get better, assuming that there's like no equivalent Black flight happens, right? Like 1 million Black people live in this live in a mostly Black city. All of them receive a significant higher amount of cash. A portion of that cash goes to taxes for the government, for schools, for libraries. That's absolutely something that could directly help these poor neighborhoods, right? Again, I don't know, no evidence, but I think I've seen
North Lawndale. Like,
different ideas.
Okay.
What up?
Now might be the best chance for me to interject.
Evan.
How's the walk going?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm finished walking, but yeah. I guess I'll just start with this question. Why don't we just do what we did in Israel, just in America? Why don't we just take Texas and be like, yo, here's a new country. All the Black folks who, want to be part of this new country should go to Texas, and the rest of America will pay that new country some amount of money, and they can do all those policies and give all those social welfare systems to the people or the new citizens of this new country, Texas. I guess.
Are you saying just for the Texas residents or for all of America?
No, just for Texas. Like, Texas is a new country. Like exactly what happened with Israel. Like, you just go in and be like, yo, it's a new country, its own government, and then the rest of America will pay this new country government X dollars, and they can do whatever they need to do to help the citizens of this new country. And all the Black people currently in any part of America are invited to move to this new.
Oh, so that is what you're saying. Okay.
I mean, that's been tried multiple times.
That sounds like a
throughout US
pretty
history.
bad idea. Just because
You're concentrating poverty to begin with.
Yeah, I was about to say, you're taking the poorest, least healthy members of our society, putting them all in one place, and we're going to be like, good luck.
It's like, look at how public housing worked out in the US, right?
Actually, that's another interesting topic in The Color of Law. It talks a lot about how, like, white people used to live in public housing alongside, it was multiracial, right? And it was a great system that was, very high quality. But when white people started segregating themselves out of public housing, the federal government just completely dropped it as a priority, cut funding like 90%, and just let it go to complete shit.
Yo, do you have the PDF of this book, by the way?
I think I do, actually.
Yeah, could you
the reason I bring this up is because I think what pervades a lot of the descriptions you've given about the systemic racism, as it were, is that resources aren't being kind of distributed to. It's almost like there's a lack of earmarking, right? Like, if you want to give extra help to just Black people, then, somehow, some way the racism stops it from actually benefiting the Black people, right? So the reason I think that this separate country thing can work is that problem necessarily goes away especially if you go one step further to kick out all the white residents of, I'm going to call it Texas again. It doesn't have to be Texas. It's just an example, right? And at that point, it's kind of like, okay, well, you can have rich neighborhoods with Black people, right? And I guess, like, I think there are other problems with the solution, but I do feel like it does get rid of the whole institution issue because you just have a separate system, right? It's not integrated. It's not what Justin was saying about how it's integrated, but it does, I think, afford its residents, which in this hypothetical scenario would be the disadvantaged Black people, to receive all the, I guess, preferential treatment that we're currently complaining about the white people in America receiving at large.
All right, so I guess I would just like to bring up sort of like, I feel like I've sort of been like harping on this whole moral framework stuff. And so this one simple, like sort of related to that, like this one like analogy that's always like been popping up in my head is just like, imagine you're in a household and maybe you have like a bunch of brothers and sisters and you just like terribly wrong one of your siblings, right? Like you like perpetually steal from them, or you take their food, or you like, I think stealing from them is probably a good enough example, but yeah, like you wrong them, right? And so then it sort of like comes to head and you feel bad about it and you like kind of want to make up for it. And so like, I just feel like, making this separate country is pretty much amounts to like, okay, well, this person who was wrong, you can just leave the house. We'll give you some stuff, deal with it yourself, but you don't need to be here anymore. And like, like we just won't need to worry about it. Like, it's just sort of like, yeah, we'll kick you out and like, you can make your own, like you can live somewhere else basically. Whereas like, I feel like, when you live in a household together or you live in a country together, right? It's like you are brothers in a way, like your brothers, like your countrymen, right? There's sort of like, I feel like there's almost like an obligation to like, like help my roommate or help my siblings or help my fellow countrymen. And it's like, I think that's sort of where like the moral imperative like part comes in for me, where it's like,
I like
whites and
that
blacks.
You're focusing on the moral imperative. And I do think that would have, that's something I'm more interested in discussing. I think a lot of the conversation so far has been very descriptive and informative in that way for me, because this isn't a topic that I'm well read in. But yeah, I do agree. Like I think there's a lot to be discussed in terms of the moral aspect of the situation. And to that point, I'd like to carry your analogy a little bit further and kind of, I wouldn't characterize it as kicking that one sibling who's been wronged out. In fact, this may not have been clear in my original proposition, but what if instead of kicking the sibling out is, let's say we had 10 siblings and they each have their own bedroom. This sibling can just pick whichever bedroom they want, have whatever freedoms that they desire to administrate their bedroom, more so than anyone else. The parents would give them extra resources, whatever, to administrate whichever bedroom they liked out of the house.
But they still need to be entitled to the resources. They need to be entitled to the resources of the whole house, right? Like they're not just going to be in their bedroom by themselves like they would be in a separate country. If they're just a separate country, then it's like, it's like that bedroom will be by themselves, and like they don't get anything. They just have to sort of manage themselves. And I think that's why the analogy came across a little bit poorly, I think, in the Texas analogy, because it sort of sounded like, because there's resources afforded to the entire country, to the entire home, right? And so that certainly needs to be, this adjustment to the analogy now, I think, is a little bit more apt.
Liberia too.
Well, then we can adjust it even further to the point where it's like, well, we don't have to talk about bedrooms. What if this family owns X estates, right? What if they just get to govern an entirely self-sufficient estate and kind of, to their own betterment? Does that then all of a sudden work?
Well,
that's one issue. And
I have two thoughts on what you're saying. So first of all, I think this is kind of like the flip side of what Osmond was saying, and that, I think Black people want to be part of American society, right? They want to be like considered but equal and full members of everything that happens in America. They want to be Americans. And I'm not Black. I don't presume to talk for Black people, but I mean, you kind of read the article and it talks about how during the Great Migration, the Black people moved to northern cities under the hope that they would be able to escape this horrible system in places like Mississippi and come to these more tolerant places and be fully accepted as members of the city and the society up there. And obviously that didn't actually come to fruition, but that was clearly the aspiration. So first of all, yeah, I don't think many Black people would actually agree to move to this hypothetical state. But second of all, I don't think white people will ever give Black people the resources they need in order to become equal if they are separated in any sort of way, right? Like you can think of like a majority Black cities now as kind of a version of what you're talking about, Kevin, which is like these kind of Black-owned spaces where Blacks are in charge of the governments, right? And they have been in control for quite a while. Like cities like Detroit or even Washington, D.C., which I think is majority Black, or Baltimore. Places that have been controlled by Black politicians for a long time, and Blacks are represented in every institution, but because they don't share a society with white people, they don't ever get the resources they actually need to become, to live up to their potential to become fully functioning. I really think we all need to be under the same roof just so that white people can recognize the humanity of Black people. I don't think it's optional. I don't think Black equality will be achieved any other way.
Yeah, can you imagine if you were like, you don't want anything radical, you're like, I want to be treated and have the same opportunities and the same treatment as everyone else in this country. And everyone was like, okay, sure, but you can go do it over there and you can figure it out yourself because we'd rather not see you than give you that right or privilege, right? I don't know, the response is just so, like, I don't know if you guys have ever felt that.
If you want to phrase it that way, I mean, again, in the same way that you are not a Black person, I am not a white person. I'm not a Black person either, so I can only hypothesize. But it seems as though in every characterization, everyone has chosen to kind of spin the proposition in a light that is dismissive. When I originally brought it up, I was thinking of it in a more constructive manner, in the sense that a lot of the problems, again, that has been articulated so far is that it's because the groups are mixed, that somehow along the way, because of some people who don't believe in kind of this vision of betterment for the Black community, that the resources are just I'm just going to say embezzled, right? But the point is, it's not getting where it was intended, right? So it's kind of like, if this is a reality that is difficult to pin down and almost impossible to eradicate, then isn't it more practically feasible to simply remove the white bit or community out of that picture, right? So Justin, you were talking about the resources to the majority Black communities in Detroit, right? Sure, there's a question, so how are they going to get the resources? Okay, will resources be given? But I liken that to the problem of after the formation of Israel, which is, will West Germany pay out to Israel to help them develop, right? That's an issue of willingness, right? And if people aren't willing to pay reparations, then I think this whole discussion about what's the best way to pay reparations is moot. The premise must be that folks are willing to pay reparations. And I think that really has to be discussed on a moral level, which is, I think, kind of what Osman was getting at, right? And then, again, going back to the moral point, I think that, well, again, with the sibling example, if there were 10 siblings, right, and one sibling was wronged, let's say sibling A was heavily wronged by sibling B, and as a result, the parents decide, okay, we're going to take resources from the household as a collective and just kind of push it into sibling A's, I guess, use, right? And I'm going to say that sibling B, let's say, cut off sibling A's like leg, right? So sibling A is, disabled for a very long time. It's a terrible, egregious crime. Right? It's something that we can almost never hope to overcome, right? But that's all the more reason why we need to help sibling A, right? Then my question is, well, for the other 8 siblings in the room looking at this situation, if I were one of the siblings, I would not be happy. For one, I don't understand why the hell sibling B just cut off sibling A's leg. But then 2, it's kind of like, well, I wasn't.
And now as a sibling, I think you're responsible for pushing his wheelchair around. It's, your siblings. It's like you take care of each other.
But okay. So if I'm willing, right? If it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I just want to help him, right? And it's voluntary. That's very admirable. But if it becomes kind of like a blanket obligation that's now thrown onto you, I can't help but imagine that at least one of the siblings out of the other 8 is not going to be happy with this. And I guess from a moral perspective, I think the interesting question becomes, is that sibling, that one sibling who might not be so happy about having to sacrifice something of their own in order to help this disadvantaged sibling, are they, is it rightful for them to be upset about this arrangement?
Yeah, it's natural, I'd say, to be upset about it, but I just
they'll be more upset if they don't see the sibling. If the sibling's never in the family room, they're always in their own room, they're always out of sight, they'll never see how that sibling suffers, right?
Yeah, so Kevin's trying to move away from the point, I feel about separating them, right? Again, I think I appreciate Kevin's point that he's trying to say that constructively, right? He's trying to he's still got the best interest in mind for sibling A, and so yeah, I like this analogy.
So they're not separate in this proposition anymore. What is it then? They're just
sibling B has wronged sibling A by cutting off his leg. So do C through F, are they are they obligated to help sibling A?
Yeah. So what my question is, who's sibling B? So A is clearly the African Americans. Mm-hmm. B is what? White people of the American government?
I guess the analogy.
Yeah,
that's a great question.
I think that's a good question. Who's who, right?
Well, I think you have to modify I think you have to modify
I feel like
every
analogy. Other, if it's not white, I'm pretty sure every other. Correct me if I'm wrong. Every other community that's not white has been wronged in some way in American history. Period.
Yeah, many people have been wronged. Absolutely.
Yeah. So B is white. D through G are all the other minorities, and. Is your point that D through G are going to get C through G are going to get pissed off because B fucked over A a long time ago and now they have to pay A for his restitutions? Is that where it's going, or because I got lost with the other siblings?
I think that's one way that you could look at the issue, right? And that's why I think it's great that we have a lot of siblings to work with here, because it may be that 7 out of the 8 all just feel what, A just got fucked so hard that I'm willing to put up with this as long as we can help A. But what about that one guy who's like, yo, I didn't do shit. Why am I getting punished? Right? Is that acceptable? Well, Osmond was saying that it's all natural.
I don't know. I think you have to modify the analogy a bit. Because it's really
the analogy, bro.
Okay, well, do you want to modify it and then I'll?
No, you can modify first. I'll modify your modification.
Okay. So my thing was it's more if B cut off the leg of A and then sold the leg.
That's what I was gonna say.
Sold the leg and then shared the profits with everyone else.
Okay, I was going to go from the can.
Actually, I don't know.
I was thinking, what now? Get a piece of leg.
I was thinking this reminds me of the discussion that's happening at Rice right now, right? With the Willie statue and the legacy of William Marsh Rice. And they're okay, he was adjacent to the slavery economy, right? He had, I think he had investments in plantations or something. He was not a slave owner, but he was.
I thought he was a slave owner.
I don't even remember, honestly. But I remember one argument being that, he didn't directly own slaves, but he had assets that involved slavery, and he was connected to the cotton trade. But the point is, he was living in the South, and he was a businessman, and that made him inextricably tied to slavery, right? Just by the transactional economy going on in Houston at the time. And like, then the question becomes like, is he responsible for, is he complicit in the tragedy of slavery? And I think the answer is generally yes, right? Because the analogy kind of falls apart because it's not just cutting off the leg; it's the impact of cutting off the leg and the benefits that the cut off leg gives to other people, right? Who didn't do the cutting but are adjacent to the cutting, right? So that's really the argument that I see a lot of progressives make, is that even if you are a white person who isn't directly connected to all this tragic racial history, you kind of benefit from the system that still exploits Black labor and cheapens Black people and their worth.
And I mean, let's be honest, it's not just like white people who maybe immigrated from East. It's like everyone, including Black people, benefits from the lives of slaves, right? Slaves were like the backbone of the Southern economy. Slaves built like so much, right? Like everyone benefited, but Black people are the only ones still getting fucked by it, right? And it's like, if we're all like, at the end of the day, who's gonna pay? The people not getting fucked. I think it's pretty clear. I don't know.
So
I'm so mad.
I like
I'm
the.
so mad you took my analogy.
I'm sorry. I
say
said you could go
he
first.
cut off the leg and he barbecued it. Then he had the most, but everyone else
He
had a slice of
barbecued
the
it. That's
leg.
hilarious.
Maybe the Asian people had like the toads. I don't know.
Value added.
Yeah.
Value added to human suffering.
So I really like the adaptation, and I think of kind of the selling of the leg in terms of describing the kind of the nature of this transgression, right? And I think you then brought up a very good point about kind of, well, if you kind of live in this country, then you kind of somehow already benefit from the proceeds of that sale of the dismemberment, right? And well, I will say at that point, the direction, the link between any given sibling or any given citizen in this country with that kind of egregious act becomes much more diluted, right? And in a way, it's in the same way that like a Black person under the institution of slavery basically comes into this world and is told, your parents are slaves, therefore you are a slave. I think in that same way, a white person coming into this world is presented with a fundamentally identical argument, because this country that you have been born into was founded on wronging slaves. You are now, and because you live here, right, you are benefiting from that. You are responsible for, kind of fixing those transgressions of the past, right? And I think on a moral level, that's a compelling argument to many. And that will create a lot of voluntary help to kind of fixing or reparations, right? But I think that's the beauty of it at the same time, that it's voluntary. And I don't think that reparations as a word kind of meshes well with this idea of voluntary assistance. And so that's why when like Osman at the beginning was like, we, and why I really wanted to talk about this idea of the collective we, I think it's too assuming to just generalize, say, we need to. Like, I understand that kind of the goal is, the point of saying we may be focused more on the idea that, it's not just about individual efforts, kind of on like a personal basis, like you having a good relationship with, a person for the person they are, rather than kind of how they look. But it should be more systematic. Like, I get that. But at the same time, when the word we is thrown around so excessively, I think it kind of turns what I think would be, in the ideal case, kind of a voluntary recognition of, say, hey, I feel that this is something I want to contribute to because I feel it sucks to have gone through that in your history, right? I think that's the most healthy way for this sort of effort to proceed, rather than kind of going around knocking on people's doors, almost like, are you a Trump supporter, right? It's like, it almost feels like if you go that direction, it's guilt tripping people. And I feel like whatever aid you kind of get out of people in that way, it's just not going to be as effective or meaningful on a philosophical level as compared with, it's purely voluntary. Like-minded people who all feel like we want to do something about this, coming together and say, hey, let's do this. And it's not kind of like something that should be written into law or general policies that, and I think that really is kind of what I have an issue with when things like affirmative action, like kind of the starting point that it comes from.
Well, that's really thoughtful points, Kevin. I really like that. I guess, to sort of like go a little meta here as far as like, why I decided to bring this up, like this topic of reparations. I mean, part of it is to like sort of, rally the troops. I mean, like this is something I feel passionate about. And I think, maybe with some more education, more knowledge, just like more sort of awareness of like the history of the United States and this history that we all live with, right? That makes it, I would hope that, like this moral imperative that I feel about this, I'm trying to like bring onto others. And so I hope I haven't, guilt tripped anybody. That certainly wasn't the point. But I understand that like, yeah, and I really like the point how like, when you do make it sort of like guilt trippy, it like, dilutes it, it makes it a little bit weaker. And so, yeah, it's been difficult for me to like bring up this topic. It's I read this article like, I don't know, like 4 years ago or something. And it's just like, one time there was this like event at like Caltech. It was this virtual event. It was over the summer where like everybody had to stop working for a day, and we had to like it was like STEM for Black Lives Matter, basically. It was like the hashtag. And so we had to like we had like a Zoom call where we talked about what we can do to like help with representation and help with general equality, and like what we're doing as like Caltech to help with Black Lives Matter. And like I was a bit shy to talk about reparations because like I don't know, I do think there is an element of like, oh, am I like, is it really like the appropriate thing to bring up? Is it like, am I guilt tripping people? Like, just because I say it, does that mean like people should like go for it? And so, no, I mean, thank you for bringing that up, because I think with reparations, I think it is difficult to bring up, because I think, I don't want you to do it just because I told you about it, but like, I think you should find somewhere deep in your heart, like, but yeah, I mean, even how I phrased it just now, I think you should do this. Like, that's not the right way to think about it, right? It's like, you should like come to your own conclusion about it. And so, yeah, I don't know. Thanks for that idea. I really. And
I think that the very word reparations, it's not conducive to that kind of thinking. It just kind of, at inception, the very idea of reparations is an obligation. Right? It's like a court would order someone to pay reparations to someone else. Whereas if it were like kind of one side wanting to, I guess, like, I just feel like reparations is not even the right word anymore.
Yeah. Interesting. What is the right word? Also, I think I interrupted somebody. Did somebody want to say something?
Yeah. So I wanted to give my like extremely pragmatic and disillusioned political take, which is that, well, I guess it's two things. First, I think a problem that was created by a system needs to be solved by a system, right? Maybe I'm just jaded, but I really think that white Americans need to be kind of forced to play their hand and kind of reckon with and address these issues, which is the point of Black Lives Matter and all these kind of in-your-face protest movements that kind of monopolize the media and take advantage of our social networks. It's the point is to get in your face and make you uncomfortable and be like, hey, this is wrong and you need to do something about it. But I think it needs to go even further in that I've read plenty of racist shit on the internet. Every time there's a local news story about crime or about some affordable
Bro, why
housing.
are you still going on these comment sections?
I mean, you see it, right? You see it, but you see the dark underbelly of this country.
Down every time, dude.
I know. I try not to, but I just like.
No, bro, you do it every time. I bet you look in the Rice comments of every Pressure article. That's
Okay, maybe I do, but it does reveal something about our country that some subset, which according to the presidential election, is probably 40% of the population, does not believe in these solutions to these problems, or even that these problems are significant or meaningful or need to be addressed. So I think the punitive sort of maybe authoritarian side in that we have to do this, right? It should not be optional. It's not voluntary. The system created the suffering and it's been perpetuating the suffering, so it needs to be dismantled somewhat aggressively.
Yeah, parents tell sibling B, apologize to sibling A for cutting off his leg.
And eating it. And eating it, even though the leg was tasty.
And that's part of like moral
nutrition.
Moral movements is that they're angry, and you need to get people riled up and like feeling that there's an injustice. But then the flip side is that I think the word reparations is kind of toxic in politics, right? It's like when they poll the idea, it's unpopular with everyone, right? You don't want to give out whatever they think reparations are. They don't want to do it, right? Which is why, like what I was saying earlier, I think the welfare state and that combined with working to dismantle these oppressive systems is in effect reparations. It has the similar outcomes without all of the political baggage of identifying people by race and knocking on doors and asking if you're descended from a slave or if you're white. All of that cultural like friction just kind of disappears, and you have like a welfare system that in principle is race blind and benefits white people too, but it disproportionately benefits Black people. And you're working to make the police stop beating up Black people and let Black people go to white people's schools and neighborhoods, then I feel like that's a good enough solution and one that is implementable, as opposed to like giving out cash to descendants of slaves.
Yeah. I mean, even more of a cynical take, I think, for me is that the deep-rooted reason people don't like reparations is that because it hurts them like very directly, and it hurts them in their pocketbooks, which is where everyone hates it, right? And I think when people vote against things like higher taxes or things like reparations, or like they justify why they won't give to certain charities or give any of their time or money or tip higher, people will have all sorts of very well-reasoned, intelligent, articulate answers, no matter where. But all of these go toward the same thing: is like, I want more money for myself, right? And so honestly, like, it sounds bad most of the time when I hear people have very strong, impassioned arguments about why they shouldn't have to pay a higher amount for healthcare, or why they shouldn't have to pay higher taxes, or why they shouldn't give more charity. At the end of the day, all I hear is money, 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 money. And it doesn't matter how well argued the other side is or how just it could be. If it hits someone directly, if it makes them have to go to school with poor kids, or makes their kids might have a possibly worse education, there's no well-reasoned argument you could have, because they'll always have something just as well-reasoned to protect their pocketbooks and self-interest. So yeah, I think it needs to be enforced. I don't think you can rely on people's goodwill. Only extends as far as it protects them, for the vast majority of people. So it needs to be the parent. It can't be the kid.
Yeah, the article did mention that the reparations program was very unpopular in Germany. It had to be a top-down solution, right?
Yeah,
Did you want to say something?
Literal Nazis were like, I don't know if what we did was bad enough. If you can't rely on literal Nazis to look back and be like, what?
David, did you have
People
something you wanted to say?
That's fine.
No. You've unmuted yourself several times.
Oh, I think I strongly agree with that, right? It's one thing to argue for a moral imperative, but in my view, full disclosure, I'm a pragmatist. Right? In my view, yeah, that moral imperative is going to hit the absolute brick wall of the practical consideration of, hey, what's the cost to me, right? Do I have to pay, or does this hurt me somehow? And I don't think any moral imperative is ever going to overcome that, because I don't want to get into this too much, but it seems like you're fighting against human nature, self-preservation. So
I don't know. I've just found it in my human nature when
well, I mean,
somebody
that's
wrongs my roommate or like my family members, like I feel bad for them, and it's like I want to do something for them. And
but that doesn't that kind of that emotional drive to do something doesn't exist in everyone. I will say that, right?
Yeah,
it doesn't extend, and that's why, for that reason, I think it's really smart to not reinvent the wheel, right? And to try to channel well, I wouldn't call it reparations, but whatever form of redistribution through existing channels.
Yeah.
Whatever.
And so I want to end this episode with just well, unless Kevin, did you want to say anything? You lit up on my
Yes,
screen.
just one point to
Okay.
to David. I think you make a very real observation that for most folks, moral imperative is not going to overcome practical financial considerations. Might be more than just financial considerations. That is human nature. We've seen it over the course of history. That, to me, though, begs the question then, what if it's so, I guess, the moral imperative is so easily overridden by something that's so inherent to human nature? What is the motivation for us to break that human nature, right? Because, like, I personally feel like, hey, we should try to stick to morality. But if in a democratic country, most people want to throw morality out the window, it's kind of like, it is kind of like Justin said, right? We need to kind of, in order to get this to pass, we need to convert to kind of like an authoritarian sort of thing where it's shoved down your throat. And, arguably good things have come from that, in the sense, like we talked previously about like the Civil War, right, being an example of that, where, despite, popular disagreement, ultimately the conflict was settled by, military acts. But then it just goes back to kind of like, why are we pushing so hard for this if it's only a select few people, a minority, that feel that this is the right thing to do?
Well, I think this plays really well into our democracy episode. And that, like, it's coalition building, right? Like, you look at what happened in the 60s. We had this huge years-long public effort by Black people to get civil rights, right? And they didn't convince every American that it needed to happen, right? It wasn't 100% in support of the Civil Rights Act, far from it. But they got a critical mass, a majority, to vote for it in Congress. And then, Democrats paid the price by losing most presidential elections for the next 20 years. Republicans, Nixon and Reagan, kind of took control after that. But, the moral imperative is important, right? I don't want to give the impression that, nobody cares about morality. That's completely meaningless. It's useful in that you can build majorities to support things, which in a democratic society means you can change the levers of power and get your reforms passed. But that's democracy, right? There's always going to be that minority in opposition, and they're going to fight really loud against it. And you just kind of have to subvert their will, because in democracy the majority gets their way. It's authoritarian in that sense, right?
Okay. Well, yeah, I think we're really over time here, so I'm going to try to close it now, unless anybody else has anything else to say. No? Okay. Well, I wanted to close it with this quote from the article that Alan actually pointed it out to me, and I really, really like it. It's just sort of what reparations means to the author, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. Reparations beckons us to reject the intoxication of hubris and see America as it is, the work of fallible humans. And I just think that's a beautiful way to sort of dispel the toxic nature of reparations. And when you say reparations, you mean money, but it's I think it means something deeper, something more human. And that's really what I wanted to get at today. So thank you guys for joining. That was a great discussion. And so let's wrap it up.